Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we're in our 24th season, I interview poets and sometimes other writers, even other forms of artists, about their craft, what they're working on now, what they've done in the past, what they might have planned for the future. So if you know of a poet or a novelist or a journalist or maybe even a sculptor or a musician or an actor, someone you think might be interested in being on the Writer's Block, please watch for our address at the end of the show. We'd love to have your suggestions. I also want to remind you that this program and all the other programs produced here at Cape Ann TV are a result of the cable program funding. It's not possible to do this kind of community television with Dish. So remember that the next time you see a Dish commercial, and stick with us here on cable television. Tonight we do have a writer, a translator by the name of Michael Glenn. And I'll give you a little bit of Michael's background. He's from the South originally. He grew up in Atlanta, went to a high school that has since disappeared, North Fulton, and then came north. He went to Princeton in New Jersey as an undergraduate, and then later to med school at Columbia in New York. So he became a northern citified person. He then spent time in the Air Force and as a doctor, and then practiced psychiatry later in and around Boston for many years and retired in 2003. One of the things he promised himself to do when he retired was to learn Spanish. And he learned it well enough to translate this brand new book called Renovation of the Moon by Emma Romeu. I'm giving it a sort of a French pronunciation. Michael will have to tell me how the Spanish goes. Welcome to the Writer's Block, Michael.
Thank you, John.
Thanks for coming out.
Glad to be here.
I should mention that one Cape Ann connection is that this was published by the Protean Press.
It is.
In Rockport, one of our
very close.
The towns in our television viewing area. Tell me about where you got the idea for this book of poetry by Emma Romeu.
Romeo.
Mm-hmm. Romeo.
Well, it actually came out of a interchange. I was looking for someone to practice my Spanish with. She was looking for someone to practice her English with. We got together and said, well, let's have conversations. So after about the third or fourth conversation, it became very clear that not only was she a writer who had written a series of children's books and environmental things, published in National Geographic, was a kind of oceanographer, scientist, but now she was working on a book of poems. So we were talking about that in our conversation, and she showed me a translation that someone had done of 2 or 3 of her poems. And I read them, and I said, this is awful. I said, I could do better than that. And she says, well, do you want to try? Because there was a question of where she was going to publish her book of poems. Was she going to publish it in the Spanish-speaking world, for example, in Mexico, or was she going to publish it here in the States?
And she had published in Mexico before.
She has a Mexican publisher, yeah. She has published with Alfaguara and other Spanish-language publishers. But there was a question, and she thought maybe she would publish in the United States. So I said, well, if you publish in the United States, it would really be helpful to publish in a bilingual edition. So
and that was this book.
We were talking about her only poetry book.
She had a manuscript at that time.
That's right. That was her first and only book of poems, 58 poems. So that got put on the table, and I came back with the translations, and she showed them to the editor up in Rockport, and the editor really liked the translations. This was early in the spring, and so she said...
Spring of 2013.
This year. So she said, well, would you like to translate the other poems and we could go for a bilingual edition? I said, when do you need it by? And she said, mid-June. I said, well, I guess so. I'm retired. I have some time. And I love actually playing with language and trying to translate. So I said yes. And so April, part of March, April, May, the translation process went on, and that was the book.
I forgot to mention one fact on your bio that I have is that you went to grad school in literature after Princeton before going to med school.
I did.
So you do have some literary background early.
I do.
Early.
Well, I've read literature and loved it all my life. So
It might be coming back. We're doing
Could
our
be.
best here. This book is called Renovation of the Moon, in Spanish, Renovación de la Luna. Can you tell us about the general themes or point of view of this book of poetries of Emma's?
Sure. It's, as her first and only book of poetry, it reflects a lot of her life. And there are basically three parts to it. The first part talks about relationships and love. The second part talks about Cuba, and there are a lot of very angry, bitter poems in that. They're well worth reading. And the third part reflects her interest in the natural world, so that you've got poems, for example, about the bee hummingbird, or flamingos, or the manatee, or the iguana, or the crocodile, that she writes specific poems to. And those are the three main areas of the book.
I didn't read, because we have the translator here rather than the author, the paragraph on the back of the book about Emma. I should probably do that now because we're going to refer to Spain
Sure.
and Mexico. She's a writer, an environmental journalist and poet. She emigrated from Cuba at the end of the 20th century and has published books with major houses in Spain, Mexico, and the United States. Her articles have appeared in international magazines such as National Geographic. So she is an experienced writer.
She is.
And she had worked with editors.
And she lives right nearby in Arlington. So it was very convenient. Yeah.
I should point out to our viewers that the poems in here are translated and published opposite each other. English on the left and the Spanish, the original Spanish, on the right, so that those of you who speak a little Spanish can read the English, or read the Spanish and check yourself with the English, or vice versa.
Or check the translation.
Check the translation. If you don't like it, get back to Michael. Or if you do like it, get back to Michael. When you said, I was kind of amazed that you had such a short time to work on these 3 months, maybe not even 3 full months. I'm always interested in mechanics. Did you get up every morning and spend 5 hours on these poems?
It was intense. It was actually intense. We did them in batches. And the process was even more complicated by the fact that I would translate something and then she would decide to change it. So it was a rolling,
That's not fair.
it was a moving process.
Did your translation in English give her good new points of view on what she was
They
doing?
did.
And
Sometimes I said, this is really not clear, and then she changed the poem. So I was actually acting in a critical way, and some of the poems actually changed because of that. But it was nice because we were meeting each week.
so not every day.
No, we were meeting each week, but I was working on it every day.
And then you would come with your work.
And then I would come with my work, we'd go over it. I mean, her English is not perfect and my Spanish is not perfect. But if I had her there, I could check the sense of the language, the sense of what the poem really meant. Because for me, the first thing was to make sure that I had the meaning. Once I had the meaning, then I felt the rest of the work is mine because I know English better, and it's my job to put what she's written into a decent English. Right. But there are many times where I didn't know what she said. And she would say, no, I mean this and not that.
Is this cases where which I see in French, I know every single word. I understand the grammar. I understand the structure. What the verb is. And I still don't know what he's talking about. Is that kind of thing because of abstraction or very idiomatic points of view?
There were some expressions that were a little idiomatic that I didn't quite understand, and she told me. But there was one. I'll tell you, I thought I was being very clever. There's one poem about. It's called Love at First Sound.
And what page is that?
It's on page 36. And it's about a woman who's in a cafe on the other side of a column from a man. And so she's looking at him and relating to the sound of his voice. Anyway, there's a line in there which says that she's always at the same table, and one day she finally challenged that pillar or that column means that she went and talked to him. But the word that she used for pillar is macizo. And I was very smart and clever, and I realized that in slang, macizo means hunk, like this gorgeous guy. So I translated it. One day I finally challenged that gorgeous guy, and so and so and so. And she said, what? I said, well, isn't that you challenged the gorgeous guy and you spoke to him? And she says, no, I mean, I challenged the pillar. I got around the pillar and so on. So the same word meant pillar and gorgeous guy.
Is gorgeous guy Spanish or slang or South
Spanish
American slang or Mexican slang?
I don't know. It's Spanish slang.
Because she may not respond. I know Britishisms and Americanisms are quite different, and I know
It's a good point. It may be slang in some other Latin American country, because she didn't really respond to, oh, yeah, of course it means that. It was like, what are you talking about?
So she didn't know the slang.
She may have, but she thought I was just kind of, she didn't know where it came from. And it came from my dictionary.
Is that a South American or Central American
Right.
dictionary? Or,
It contains
or Spanish?
all sorts of Spanish. It's a huge book. Yeah.
Could you take a poem that I mentioned before we went on? I was kind of interested in the very first poem because it's titled Poetry, and this is a book of poetry.
Yep.
And I wondered if you might read both the English and then the Spanish, and we could begin to talk about some of the mechanics and the
Sure,
creativity
if you like.
in translation.
Okay, you want the Spanish first?
Up to you.
Okay. So it's called Poesía. I'll make a little break after the lines. Cuando a las otras voces las silencia el asombro, llega la poesía, va sola. No la alcanza el miedo a que la culpen, ni la linden fronteras. En piruetas transita el aire, el polvo, el agua encendida, y solo se detiene para clavar su sagaz estilete en las costillas de la vulgaridad. So,
Vulgaridad.
right. So I translated, when surprise silences other voices, poetry arrives, and goes it alone. Fears of being blamed don't reach her, nor do frontiers touch her. In pirouettes she passes through air, dust, and flaming waters, and only stops to thrust her shrewd dagger in between the ribs of vulgarity.
That's very nice.
It's
I
a good
love
poem.
that dagger, the dagger image, the ribs of vulgarity. Very nice. Now, can you tell us something about any problems that came up in this poem that sort of illustrate the challenges of translation?
Well, there's a number of things. First of all, Spanish poetry is built on syllables. It is not a stressed language. English is stressed, and English poetry is built on the metrical,
The rhythms.
the rhythms.
Yeah.
So, knowing that, and knowing that Spanish goes bup, 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 without the accents, I need to understand not just the sense of the poem, but her voice. She has a very innocent, light, lyrical voice, sometimes mocking, but it's very innocent and flows kind of sweetly. So I don't want to translate that heavily or adding all sorts of flowery things or make it academic. It has to be simple. But there are other problems with Spanish and English too, which is word order. In this particular thing, the fourth line, the Spanish is, doesn't her reach the fear to which they blame her. Now, you don't know what the heck that means. And the next one, well, so I broke that up into two lines and made it fears of being blamed don't reach her, so that it goes back to what English is usually, where the subject comes first and then the verb and then the objects. Whereas in Spanish, it's a little bit like Latin. You can put words almost anywhere and people understand what you're putting them. You have a lot more freedom to put the subject or the verb or prepositional phrases almost anywhere in the sentence.
Just let the conjugations and the declensions determine the meaning. But you're very careful about the lines. The Spanish here is 11. I think the English is 12 lines. But I know from my little Spanish that there's often very identical word correspondence and line correspondence.
Right. That's what I try to do. But what I might change is instead of saying doesn't reach her the fear to which they blame her, I make some sense out of it by putting the subject first and then the object, verb and object. And that happens in a lot of other poems.
You mentioned also you translate poetry as she.
That's right. Poetry is feminine in Spanish, but you don't call it she, actually. And I felt it made more sense in English to call poetry she rather than an it. In English, a lot of times we call poetry it, but it felt more like her voice to personify it a little bit.
So it's la poesia.
La poesia.
But if you refer to poetry in general in a conversation, you say it's very popular today in America.
Mm-hmm. If you refer in Spanish, you don't even use a subject. You just say es, is, and people understand your meaning. It is.
So you've got layers of problems. You've got or challenges, I should
Right.
say. You've got to get the structural, not the structural, but the explicit meaning.
Yep.
But you've got to get the tone,
Right.
and which means kind of very delicate nuance of
Right.
the personality of the narrator, whether the narrator happens to be the poet or not. 3 months. I'm impressed.
Well, we worked hard.
Can you would you take another poem and talk about some of the aspects of that?
Let me give you a real simple one that talks about one problem.
Okay.
She has a poem on page 10 about the gaucho. And the first two lines are, the gaucho was like the history of America, savage in his genesis, and it goes on about the gaucho. Now the first line is exactly that. The gaucho is like the history of America. The next word, which I translate savage, is indómito. And here the question comes up, well, you got the sense of it, what it means, but what do you translate? If you want a word that sounds like the Spanish, you can say indomitable. Indomitable in English is a very heavy word. I never heard anyone use it. So I don't really want to say indómito. But there's other kinds of words to use. You could say untamed. You could say savage. You could say wild. So you kind of are stringing all the other words in the poem out, and then you come back to this thing, indómito, and it's a question, what are you going to use for that? And that's where the choice is. You go to a thesaurus, you go to a dictionary. English is a very large language, and lots of words have lots of associations and suggestions, and depending on your own psychology, a certain word might fit. As a poet, when you're writing a poem, all the words kind of fit together. You don't pull one word from the 18th century and drop it in the middle of 20th century words, and you don't pull a very Latinate word that no one uses and drop it in kind of a narrative poem. So this is the kind of thing.
And you want delicate kind of parameters.
Right.
You want a word that suggests purple, rain, and immediacy, and
Yeah. Let me read you one other poem.
Oh, I have a question about that poem. The first line is El gaucho es como la historia de America. Now, when a Spanish-speaking person writes America, does that mean all of the New World?
Yes.
Or does it mean, in our cliche,
No.
the United States?
The New World.
Was that a difficult translation?
No, that was clear. I understood very well what she meant. I understood very well what she meant there.
Yeah. Can you expect normal, average American readers to get that? I used American in that sense just now.
Probably, although it might be a little ambiguous. One could also translate it like the history of the New World, or all the Americas, or the Americas.
Plural.
But I liked it the way it was.
Okay.
So let me read you just a very simple poem. This, I think, is her voice, which I try to translate into English. It's a poem on page 4. It's extremely simple. It's a love poem to her husband, and it says, the sea. And she's talking about two other writers here. Martí is a Cuban poet, and Borges is an Argentinian writer. So we have a lot of literary allusions about the sea, but I'll give you the English. She says, for Martí, the sea is an enormous monster, and for Borges, a mirror in his blindness. For me, it's the afternoon I loved you in its depths, the water that translated what wasn't said, the breath with which we aroused the waves. That's a very lyrical, tender ending to a poem that seems like, oh, is she going to get literary on us?
I have to say, you mentioned that she's a very tender, kind of almost naive,
With the innocent voice,
innocent. And I found myself thinking that some of these poems were by two different people, because this poem, The Sea, which has to do with love, and it's very, very delicate and soft and moving, it doesn't seem like it's written by the same person who wrote The Rat, which is a savage.
Yep.
Just
Well, she
gouging
changes
poem.
personality when she talks about Cuba. That's for sure. There's a lot of bitterness there. What happened to her family, what has happened to a number of people over the last 50 years. So, yeah, when she writes about Cuba, she's quite bitter.
How old is Emma?
58. The number of years as the number of poems in the collection.
Was that the intent, or
Yeah,
was that a happy
so.
accident?
I think it was her intent.
So she could stay young forever with this book.
Yes.
I had a couple of poems. Excuse me, if you want to go ahead with
No,
another
go
one. I'd like to refer to that poem, The Rat, which I just mentioned, because I read several of these poems that refer to directly to Cuba or morality or animals. And this struck me, because I could understand the title in Spanish and English too. La Rata, The Rat. Would you read your translation of this, and then we could talk for a minute about this this poem?
It's called The Rat. A rat climbs up through bottomless tunnels, bites in silence, looks docile, reaches a cave, and then gnaws away, vomits from being overstuffed with hate, and kills alone. It's a rat. Another rat ran along the Havana coast in times of strict socialist rationing, came and went in search of food, came and went and didn't find anything, and because of not wanting to eat others, ate its own tail. It too was a rat. But there are rats and rats. So,
I read that several times because I wasn't sure I understood it clearly, and I wasn't sure I understood it clearly after the fifth time. I picked up first its savagery, its harshness. Is the rat Cuba, or can I say something that's simplistic about the symbolism in the poem?
sure.
Okay, I will. It seems that she is certainly judgmental about the rat, but has some sympathy for it too. The rat's sort of doing what rats do, and is helpless in a way because of its being starved and it's being rationed.
Well, I think what she's doing is making a moral point. The first stanza describes rats in nature, a real rat. And the second describes another rat in a socialist economy, according to the way Emma looks at it. And what this rat does is decides to sacrifice itself rather than do injury to other people. So it's a moral statement about this rat who...
Country rat and the city rat.
Yeah. A normal rat that gorges on everybody and, winds up overstuffing itself and vomiting, and a rat that pulls back from doing that, even if it means its own life. So it's a serious poem.
Indeed. I got the 5-minute signal a little bit ago from Nick, our floor director, and so I want to do a couple things that I haven't done yet. I want to hold the book up again. The audience has seen the website,
Okay.
and it's seen where to get the ebook, and I want to make sure that I show this again, and you can tell me while this is up where our viewers can buy this book.
They can buy it on a website of the Harvard Bookstore. which I guess they've seen. So it's a Harvard bookstore, books, and then renovation of the moon. And they should be able then to get a copy of the book.
And it's down at, in Harvard Square too, physically?
I'm not sure if it's physically there. I think you have to order it on this online thing, and then a copy will be delivered.
So it's a download process.
Correct.
And
you
it
ask
is-
for it, and then they'll
I
mail
want
it
to
to
say,
you.
I'm not going to mention the price, but very reasonable.
Good.
Very reasonable. And I have to say, the poems are powerful. And it's interesting to see the translation next to the original and realize how much you can understand. And if it's not immediately understandable, piece it together.
Yeah, if you know French or Spanish, Italian, it's really wonderful to have a bilingual edition.
Yeah.
Because you don't have to just trust the English edition. You can actually tease it out a little for yourself.
Yes, and if you stick with your Romance languages, you're okay,
So
as long
far,
as you
so
don't
good.
get into
Right.
Polish or Russian or something like that. I just got the 3-minute signal from Nick, and I'm going to have to begin to wrap up.
Okay.
The title of the book, which Michael Glenn translated, is Renovation of the Moon. That's the English. It's a Spanish book. The Spanish, which appears also on the cover, Renovación de la Luna.
Very good.
And it is by Emma Romeu and translated by our guest this evening, Michael Glenn. I enjoyed the translations and I enjoyed the book. I want to thank you very much for coming down.
Thank you, John. My pleasure.
I want to thank our TV audience as well. If you've learned something about translation and the creativity of translation from Michael Glenn tonight, and something about Emma Romeu's poetry in Renovación de la Luna, then the Writer's Block has done its job. I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.